Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good Podcast. On Wednesdays, we like to talk about the role of faith in the common good in the world that we find ourselves living in. And it is the 26th of April today. And very glad to have Jon Ward with us. Jon is an author. So we're going to be talking about this book and other books that Jon has written. Also a journalist and someone whose own story fits very well in the conversation of this podcast, as we spend a lot of time asking people to consider what's been their own identity, what's been their own religious tradition, what has formed their sense of civic engagement, how do they live in the world. Well, Jon has written a great book called Testimony Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed the Generation, and writes it as an insider to that very evangelical movement and somebody who was a part of that generation. So Jon, thank you so much. As we were chatting earlier, I'm really thrilled that you're here and really appreciate this book a lot. So thanks for being with us today.
Oh, I'm glad to be here, Doug. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. So catch us up on what you're doing now. You live in D.C. By the way, we'd like to check in with the weather. It's gorgeous in Minneapolis today. Dan's in the background. I'm guessing it's great in Michigan. How are things in Washington, D.C. today?
I was just texting my wife that it is really nice outside. It was hot last week, and then it cooled down, I think Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and we're back up to high 60s, no humidity. Really nice. Yeah.
It's just, yeah, there's something magical about Washington, D.C. in the spring. So great.
It is. Yeah.
Well, something that hasn't been as beautiful to people is, their experience inside the evangelical tradition that seemed to break the promises that were made to a lot of people when they were younger and deep adherents. So we'll talk a bit about that. But remind us what you're doing now. You're a journalist. Tell us how you do that, and
Sure.
what kind of journalism are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, I've been in this job for 20 plus years. And about 2011, I started covering political campaigns from a national perspective. That was at Huffington Post at the time. And so I covered the 2012 presidential election. I got very wrapped up in sort of a competitive drive to get scoops, to be a nationally known political reporter, which really involves trying to go behind the curtain of what's happening inside national politics, and bringing readers inside with you. A lot of cachet is built up around taking people behind the curtain, and getting sort of little nuggets of information. For example, 2012, I think I came in second. I would like to be able to say that I came in first. I think Chuck Todd beat me by 2 minutes or something on breaking the news of the vice presidential pick, which was Paul Ryan at the time. But that was kind of where I was at for several years. And then 2016 rolls around, and we see what happens to the Republican Party, and that sent me in a different trajectory, where I started to think about how can I do my job in a way that is not just about building my own career or brand, but about trying to serve our readers, to help them understand what is happening to our politics. And that's really regardless of where they stand ideologically, or which party they're a part of, or who they voted for. I really began to want to try to illuminate how politics works, what are the structural drivers that create outcomes, good, bad, or otherwise. And so I started to try to do that, and to also try to think about how can I do journalism that points towards solutions, and not just pointing out what are problems. And part of that is, there is an incentive in journalism to stand back, critique, and go no further. Just point out what's wrong. And I felt an obligation and a call to do more than that, and to put a little bit of skin in the game, in terms of saying, I'm a citizen of this country as well, even as I'm also a journalist. I do think that sometimes journalism can take the sort of bystander approach too far, and not have an investment. And as we'll probably talk about, I think evangelicalism imbues people with a certain sense of a bystander effect, and or maybe actually more of an antagonist effect, because there's certainly not a stakeholder attitude that I see towards sort of the common good.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about that journalism, just so people get a picture of it. We tend to use phrases like journalism, media, the news. We kind of use those interchangeably, right? And they really are a large sector. There are many kinds of journalism. There's different kinds of media. There's different sorts of news. What is it that keeps you in it? Like, what's the part of those worlds that you say to yourself, this is really where I want to share and spend the time of my life? Because you've chosen, you write about it in the book, we can get to that in a bit, but journalism's actually been very helpful for you, being a journalist, taking on a journalistic perspective. Can you talk a bit about what that is and what part of the whole industry of journalism, media, news you see yourself in?
Sure. I think just the first thing that comes to mind is that I have questioned over the last couple of years, um, whether I wanted to stay in journalism. It's been discouraging to pour a lot of time into trying to act, to perform an act of service for those who choose to read what I write, um, and to feel as if it's doesn't matter, at the end of the day,
Yeah.
just because of the massive amount of change that's happened to the information environment in this country and in the world
Hmm. Hmm.
over the last 2 decades, certainly. And you kind of alluded to it, that there's a lot of different kinds of media. I remember when I was covering the Obama White House in 2009 for the Washington Times, which is a conservative paper,
Hmm. Yeah.
but I was able to develop some level of a working relationship with White House press secretary at the time, Robert Gibbs. And I did an interview with him early on in that administration, trying to understand how they were going to be approaching presidential communications in a media environment that I was writing about then was very fractured, um, and sort of the old gatekeepers were losing
Yeah.
power. That was 14 years ago, and that that dynamic has really just sort of increased and intensified year over year,
Yeah.
with a lot of compounding interest. So we're really in a Wild West media environment now. Um, I came up in a newspaper, the Washington Times, and was trained in how to, write an inverted pyramid news story, which is just get to the point, tell the reader the top news. I was also trained in reporting on basic facts at a local news level, writing about Washington D.C. and some of the suburbs. Very basic local news type stuff. That type of training is much rarer now. I think
Mm.
if you go to a newspaper or a couple online news outlets, you'll get some of that. Local news organizations, I think, provide some of that. Um, I think journalism schools provide some of that. But back in the day, when I was coming up and before that, I think journalism schools were looked at as not enough,
Mm.
not providing enough of that kind of training, because you actually need to do it. And if you're writing for your college newspaper, that's a way to get some of that training.
Right.
But it really does take, touch the stove moments where you get the name of a parent whose child has died wrong. Like, if that never
Yeah.
happened to me, but other things like that have happened. I've done things like that. And it's really those moments of getting issues, small details, but issues of vital importance, at least to some person or small group of people. It's when you get those things wrong
Yeah. Right on. Yeah.
in the past that you felt the weight of how important it is to get it right. That is that is not quite the case these days. I mean, I wrote a survival guide. I've written 2 survival guides for normal people over the last few years, and in one of them, I talked about how if anybody can make any accusation or claim online, let's say about national politics or national
Mhm.
issues, and if we don't hold our media and communication and information environment to a standard, then ultimately we're going to live in a world where anybody can make any claim they want about you online, and there won't be much we can do about it. So that actually, at the end of the day, is one of the reasons why I think it's so important to have these conversations about trying to uphold standards and rules for the conversation we have about public life and
Right.
outside the realm of private belief.
Yeah, and it sounds like what you're saying, and I hope you are, that there's a deal that's made between the industries of journalism, media, news, and the people who consume it, that that people are going to act in good faith, that they're going to serve one another, right? That there's an implicit deal. Often that deal is broken, right? And that's a frustration that we live with. And what do people do about it? So they change media outlets, or they listen to different types, or they take on alternative formats. That's a very similar thing to what religion does, right? That there's a deal made. And one of the things I think is fascinating about your book, the subtitle, inside a movement, the evangelical movement that failed a generation, is provocative. It's what the book is about. But so is the actual title, which is testimony,
Mhm.
right? This book is, and there's a lot of reporters who are writing books about trying to understand the evangelical circumstance and where we found ourselves. We're an organization that, formed to try to not only understand that, but move it and bump it and give people an alternative to it. So there's a lot of work being done in those spaces. But this book is called Testimony, and it is, right. You're talking about your own experience as an insider, and then where you find yourself now. And I find that to be intriguing, and to be interesting. Was framing your own history, past desires, frustrations with an evangelical perspective of the world 20 years ago through today, were you confident in writing a book that's this sort of first person focused, that tells your own story? Did you struggle with that? Did the publisher want more of that, less of it? Like, how did you end up saying, no, look, Jon Ward is actually going to be a character in this book, and my own experience is going to be a major part of the lens by which I tell this, to tell what I'm going to tell in this book.
What'll be really interesting is to ask me this question in 10 or 20 years, because
There you go.
I'm sure that I'll have some more precise thoughts on it at that point, especially with the benefit of hindsight. But I think the germination of this book actually lies in the fact that um, God made me a writer, and by that I just mean I carried a quote around in my wallet for a long time from David Remnick, who's the editor of the New Yorker, that he gave to the Washington Post in the late 90s, I think, when he came on. I carried this around in my wallet for years. It just said, like, it doesn't matter what you're writing about. What matters is that you write beautifully about it. So I kind of always had this
Hmm.
uh, desire to praise the world through writing,
Hmm.
um, and praise is not always flattery. Praise is only effective if it's based in reality,
Hmm.
which is why I think critique is an important part of the process. Um, and so I kind of always knew that I had grown up in a unique, different, and pretty interesting environment, and I kind of always knew I wanted to write about it. Um, and for many years, I just sort of sat on it, thought, occasionally about it, but didn't really see a relevance for my story to any broader, set of circumstances or anything really.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I there's a sense in which I wrote my first book, which I think I sold it in 2013 and then published it in 2019. And that was just about, political history, about Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. I really enjoyed writing that book, just as I mostly really enjoyed writing this book. I just love the process.
Uh-huh.
I learned a ton through the process, but there is a way, and there is one aspect in which I wrote that first book to be able to publish this book, because at the time I didn't really
Mhm.
see a way for me to publish a book about um, my upbringing, nor did I, again, see a
Right.
relevance to it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. What's the point in that? Right.
right. And so then, after the last several years, I began to see some relevance for it. And the question of putting myself into the story brings me back again to what I'll think about it in 10 to 20 years. Um, I think at the time, I just felt like this was a good way to tell the story. And I still feel that way.
Yeah.
And of course, it's uncomfortable to put things out there that are personal. And what is really fascinating is the interior process of self-questioning that goes on, about, what were my motives for doing for
Right.
doing this? And when you layer on top of that some of my background in like Calvinist Christianity, it makes that whole dynamic even more complicated.
Mhm.
But it's out there, and at a certain point, you're you're pregnant with it, and you have to move forward and accept what comes.
You have a great preface and introduction. In fact, I'd encourage people before the book arrives, if they're going to order it, or they can get to their bookstore to pick it up, to go when they go on to Amazon, to click on the look inside part, and they can read the preface and read the introduction. They're both spectacular. In the preface, you tell a little story. Oh, not there yet, Dan. That's going to come from the thanks. That's going to come from the introduction. But in the preface, you have this little bit where you recount a story of being on Morning Joe in October of 2016. Um, I actually remember you being on Morning Joe in October of 2016. I'm super into politics and stuff. I pay a lot of attention anytime they have conversations about evangelicalism. And you make you had done some pieces for Yahoo News, and a lot of us were thinking about what role evangelicals were going to play and how they were going to act and how they're going to turn out, what were their motivations and all this stuff. And
Yeah.
I remember after reading your recounting of that short story of your experience there, um, that I saw that and felt similarly how the many people who cover the media and talk about evangelicals as a political force, which
Mm.
they are, there's just a cultural force, don't always have firsthand knowledge of the ideas and the language and the motivations. And there's a lot of people who just simply say, like, what is with these people, right? And they literally these people or those people, them, right? They don't know on the inside. And uh, I wonder if you started the book with that preface, the preface with that story, because you wanted to remind people that, look, there's a complicated story here, not making any excuses for people. It's just that there are reasons why people behave and act the way they do and think the way they do, right? They're not just robots following orders that have been programmed into them. They're actually motivated by things that make sense to them, and they have a whole view of the world that makes sense to them. Can you talk a little bit about that, what you know about the evangelical experience now, as someone who, as a journalist, also covers it and interacts with other people in media and outside of media, people who consume your media, trying to understand this group of people? And how do you talk about that overall, in addition to when someone says, hey, what's your book about? But just your role of helping people understand the issues that motivate evangelicals and
Yeah.
the lack of understanding. I'm not even sure it's always misunderstanding, but at least the lack of understanding.
Yeah. The words that are coming to mind that I think I'll use here are patience and totalizing. Um,
Huh.
and I'll just say, by way of a preface to this, that one of the reasons that we have the scene on Morning Joe at the very beginning, I believe it was suggested to me, maybe. I can't remember by who, but by someone who was helping me revise the manuscript at an earlier, date, that there needed to be some scene early on to kind of introduce the reader to, I don't know, who I am now relatively, and sort of what I do and what my credentials are, in some respects. I'm a journalist. I go on TV occasionally. I've done work on evangelicalism, and then the other theme coming out of that first scene is one of liminality, or being in
Mm-hmm.
between
Mm-hmm.
worlds, or being what Mako Fujimura calls a border stalker, which is not at
Yeah.
home in any one particular context or tribal group, and
Yeah.
trying to bring understanding between groups. Um, and I think what you were getting at in your question was this word totalizing, which is, if you're in a fairly closed off subculture, and it could be evangelicalism, it could be other ones too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that closed system of knowledge and practice and culture, um, embeds itself in you pretty deeply. And I think that dynamic is even, more true if you're raised in an environment like that,
Yeah.
and spend all or most of your childhood and your formative years in that world. And that was me. Our church was, in the early days, coming out of the Jesus movement in the 70s and 80s. Our church really kept to itself, and shunned outsiders and looked at outsiders. And I'm not just talking about non-Christians. I'm talking about other Christians
Right.
who weren't in our church. We looked at outsiders as not having, the answers that we had. So pretty naive and hubristic.
Mm-hmm.
And there are elements of that to different degrees within a lot of evangelicalism, I think. And I think the reason why I can make that assertion fairly confidently is because I think a lot of evangelicalism has been shaped, um, by the dispensationalist mindset that was really dominant in the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe even into the 90s and even the aughts. I think that's changing now. The dispensationalist theology, which really talks and thinks a lot about the rapture and the end times. The New Apostolic Reformation is sort of agnostic on it, or doesn't talk about it, but practically speaking, they take a different approach, where they're trying to bring God's kingdom on earth rather than sort of waiting for the rapture. But that mindset, I think, drives people to be isolationist and escapist, the dispensational mindset.
Yeah. Yeah,
And it
for
was,
people who don't know, that phrase represents the dispensations, represents the idea that there's different periods of time and dispensations, and this theory goes, we're living in one of those times where we're preparing ourselves for life eternal. So the implication of that often is, don't get so involved in things of the earth.
right.
Right. Spend your time preparing yourself, getting personally ready, collectively ready as a religion, a faith community for the life that God's going to have for you. And that stands in opposition to people who are like, no, hang on a minute. We have a call to make things here on earth. May the kingdom come and your will be done on earth as is in heaven. Those worlds are in competition. I think what you're raising, which is important, because a lot of people only have heard Christianity from one or the other of those vantage points, right? Where they're like, I thought we were supposed to be good to our neighbors and love each other and reach out and care and, think about the least of these. And others are like, I thought we were supposed to protect ourselves from a combative world and keep ourselves pure for the later days. And then they look at what's going on now and they're like, I have no idea what's happening. Like, why are these people wanting to take over the federal government and local
Yeah.
school boards in order to enact their version of Christianity? That sounds like a theocracy and not a theology. And so there's all this swirl that goes around. And so I'm just sort of clarifying that
Yeah.
you're able to walk into this world, recognize sort of the landscape. You're like a docent in an art gallery, or a naturalist in a out in the woods, saying to people, notice this and look at that, and here's how this functions, and here's how we understand these things. That can be quite, that whole world can be quite hard for people to wrap their heads around and know what's going on. And
For sure. Yeah, and what's interesting also is that the new Calvinism, which became very popular 20 plus years ago, they're not dispensationalists really. They don't really, I don't think they have that view of the end of the end of the world or their eschatology. But they nonetheless also tend to stay out of the public square for the most part. And it's actually the people who were, uh, I use these archetypes in the book, C.J. Mahaney and Lou
Mhm.
Engle. And Lou Engle is more of an archetype of the people who were really into, I don't know if he was into dispensationalism, but they would have been more that direction in the 70s. And they've now become much more political. And the folks who went the new Calvinist direction, like CJ, are more quietist. So,
Yeah.
all of this to say, um, these worlds are totalizing. And
And
somebody
say
else,
more about that, what that means.
yeah,
Like these worlds
yeah,
are totalizing, that sometimes people can think that the thing that they've experienced is is the end all and be all. But say a bit about what the impact of totalizing ideas, and even for people who don't know the word totalizing.
yeah. Well, it was actually just something that somebody said in a conversation earlier this week, and I thought that's really helpful. And it just means that your sense of reality is defined pretty comprehensively, I guess, by the subculture that you're in. Um, there's not a ton of recognition that there are multiple other perspectives with valid points of view or questions, maybe even that challenge your assumptions or your view. And so it leads to a certain sense of um, overconfidence, I think, in your judgments, and a lack, maybe more importantly, a lack of pause or questioning, um, which can lead to holding your presumptions with a more open hand or looser grasp, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
So can I quote back to you something you did write in the introduction here? That we can put this part up, Dan, on the screen. Um, you have this section where you, in the introduction, which by the way, your introduction is just tremendous as a standalone piece. I would just commend it. I don't know if you originally wrote it as an essay or something else, but it's really quite remarkable, and I think encapsulates some very powerful ideas that people are really very much going to want. But you have this bit where you're writing about the role of truth and its importance to you, both in your Christian faith, but also how journalism has helped you pursue truth in a larger way. And so you're talking about truth, and if it's okay if I read your words back to you, you write this: truth is not a script. It's not a cheat sheet for life. By the way, I read that truth is not a cheat sheet for life. And I'm like, that is just a great line. So good for you. I wanted you to say more about when that popped into your head, or if that was a piece you use all the time. Then you go on to say, truth does not come from picking a set of answers and then arranging all the questions so they line up correctly. Truth starts with questions. It requires an openness to other points of views and experiences, to being wrong, to changing one's minds. A commitment to truth involves a passion to embrace critical thinking. And then you go on, you skip part. I'm going to read this next little bit and then let you talk about it. First and foremost, you say truth seekers don't search for battles outside themselves to win. Instead, truth seekers examine their own point of view, searching for holes, weaknesses, and errors in their own thinking. Truth seekers don't pretend to understand others' points of views. They inhabit them, walk around in them, try to gain perspective. They hold their conclusions with an open hand, and yet at the end of the day, a truth seeker does not shy away from speaking up. So I don't know if that's what you were getting at here, with the phrase totalizing it, but those are just great paragraphs. You said, your point is to know what you're writing about, write about it in beautiful ways.
mm.
I would grant a beauty award to those phrases. I think they're really great. Do you want to say any more about that, or do you feel like that sort of does it, or what? I mean, you
No,
lay this out in the introduction. I think it seems important to what you're up to.
no, you're drawing something out right now, which that point about starting with the answers and then arranging the questions. Um, There's something to that point that's not in the text there, which is that I think in a lot of these totalizing cultures, we can start out not just with answers, but with answers about ultimate things.
Yeah.
And then we rearrange the questions of probably more material things to
Mm.
fit the answers. So I
Mm-hmm.
think there's
Mm-hmm.
an extra dynamic to that idea that I didn't fully lay out there. But I I observe that there is often in religious settings, um, I observe that there is a certainty about things that we cannot prove
Yeah.
ultimately that require faith. Um, and then what has been striking is that over the past few years in particular, there has been a relativism about things that we actually can know with a high degree of certainty. And there has been a relativistic attitude towards those things because of the chaotic information
Right.
environment and because of a breakdown, I argue, in the evangelical church's ability or intent to disciple its followers into discernment and public character. There has been a breakdown in many aspects of American life and in global
Mm-hmm.
life, but certainly in the evangelical church, in the ability to have, I think, a healthy process for assessing these more concrete issues. And yet there's relativism about things we can know and certainty about things we can't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so there's this odd dynamic. I mean, I've my personal view on faith is that if you say you know something for sure, you have somewhat eliminated the need for faith, because faith is the gift that we need to have hope and some degree of confidence in
Mm-hmm.
something
Mm-hmm.
that we actually have to acknowledge we don't know for sure is true.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And look, and it's not only inside religion where this stuff happens, right? There, a totalizing attitude, especially a totalizing attitude about others, is super common, right?
Yes,
Like, hey, no, I know enough to understand what motivates those people or what they do. And part of the struggle with all this is that we're human beings, and most of us, when it comes to our beliefs, we are not organizing our beliefs from most significant and important up to least important, and then drawing conclusions about other beliefs off of some pyramid. Rather, we have a whole lot of beliefs rolling around in our minds and our hearts and our experiences and our family stories. We're trying to reconcile those most of the time. We have things that make sense in one set of circumstances that are totally opposite of the way we would think about it in another one. And we're just trying to make sense of it all. And systems, religious systems, political systems, media systems, um, like to eliminate all of that difference, all that frustration. You just kind of flatten out the curves, add a little story in there to add some personal dynamic to it, um, and, and and that is a way to get after some things we need to know.
sure.
Look,
But it's
that's
also
just
about
true.
money a lot of times.
Say it again.
I said, yes, it is. It is something we can't walk around, just never coming to conclusions. But there's also money at the bottom of a lot of this, the desire for profit, and that is a lot of what eliminates nuance and context in the current media world that we live in, because the business
Sure.
models that we have all drive us towards in the media drives towards accumulation of as many eyeballs on cable TV or clicks on the internet, and what clicks and what rates is not complexity. It is simplicity and reductionism and black versus white, good versus evil, villains versus heroes. And
Hmm.
I've tried very hard in this book, and I don't know, I'm sure I failed in some respects to do this, but I tried very hard not to de- not to demonize any one individual or group of people,
Hmm.
while still critiquing people who I think made mistakes, who did damage to others, But ultimately, at the end of the day, not to feel as if I'm upset with them as much as I'm upset with the incentive structures that I think
Mm.
shape their behavior.
Yeah, and look, and we all participate in them, right? Not only with our dollars. I'm not just saying the things you choose to spend your money on, which is true. That's just a different point than one that I'm trying to get at. We participate in them because they serve us in some way, right? One of the big questions we like to ask around our work when we talk to somebody of difference is not only what do you believe and why do you believe it? Those are important questions,
Mm-hmm.
but to consider what function that belief has in a person's life, because we tend to have results come from the things that we hold deeply. And if we don't interrogate for ourselves and think about in an empathic way about the role that it plays in another person's life, you sort of miss the human element of it. And I guess it's fine to go through life just turning people into data points, and information centers and facts. But we're better off in a human experience, which is mostly what we're dealing with here, recognizing that people have all kinds of motivations for all sorts of things that they don't have explanations for.
Yeah.
As somebody who's been a parent now, I have adult children, and so now we're in the second sort of generation. And, and when you're parenting, there's this tendency to want to say to your kids, especially adolescent age kids, like, "Why did you do that?" As if someone's behavior has an explanation for why it makes sense. Like our kids and I, as a teenager and a young adult, and even as an older adult, have done such dumbass things that when someone says, "And how did that make sense?" You're like, "There is no world in which this made sense." It doesn't mean I didn't do it. It doesn't mean I might even do it again, because that's not how a human being makes their way through life. And sometimes we look at other groups, whether it's non-evangelicals looking at evangelicals or religious people looking at non-religious people or whatever, however it goes. And we're like, well, they probably have really good reasons for what they're doing. And if I poke around enough, I'll figure out what the reasons are. And if I find out who pays them, then I'll know their reasons. Like, good luck with that. Because I've just known too many people that it's never once been that simple to sort of get to the bottom of something, on why it is the way that it is.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned the word patience earlier, and we've talked about the ways that our our contexts and our incentive structures shape us. I've talked about how these totalizing cultures are deeply rooted in us and embedded in us. And so I think for people outside of a religious subculture, um, that, I'm sort of making, I hope somewhat explicitly, certainly implicitly, I'm making a request to be patient with people who are coming from that context who you might disagree with. If you see them making an effort to grow or evolve or learn, take that as a sign of positivity. And I would even apply this to people who are inside, maybe evangelicalism, who might listen to me and think you're just talking down at me and saying, "Oh, other people should be patient with me because I need to become more like you."
Right.
Well, no, I'm just saying if you disagree with me and you want me to come more towards you,
Yeah.
um, I'd ask for your patience as well, because that's the way we should. That's what it means to love one another, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of, give me a minute here. These kinds of changes don't come easy to people. Can I also ask you this? It feels like, and I haven't finished all the book, so that's my apology. So maybe you get to this, but I feel like you're saying it in the first third of the book that I've had a chance to read, that um, you don't come at this conversation about an evangelical movement that failed the generation as someone for whom the system didn't work, or you were violated by it, or it was a broken thing that was just all smoke and mirrors and a big trick. You're like, no, look, it works. It does a thing. I was in that world. It produced a certain outcome. That outcome maybe even got me to where I am today. I'm trying
Mhm,
to reconcile
mhm,
how complex it is and how many things there are and how many competing narratives are within this. So you're approaching it as someone for whom the system worked, and you still want to say it was a failure, or
mhm,
it failed in some of its higher some of its higher callings. Is that right? That you're not coming at it as someone for whom you're like, hey, I've got it. I want to, I want to get Katie Porter on the fact that there was a violation of a promise from a sale here, and I want someone to put in a claim about how the warranty was faulty. You're saying I was in, and this thing worked. Like you start out with in your room listening to music, and you tell stories about its positive impact on your life, and yet it wasn't all that. Is that fair? Is that how you think about it?
It's a great question. I love it. I would say two things. One, I've never considered myself a victim of, the way I was raised. I think that word can obviously be applied to some people in this context. Obviously, those who were physically or sexually abused or emotionally or spiritually clearly abused, and oftentimes were then ill-served, um, or further abused by the church's response to that. That's clearly a category of victimization. It's much more complicated for people like me, who, somebody texted me from the church and said, they enjoyed the book. They weren't criticizing it. They were saying it's cool to see people who have landed on their feet after coming through that experience. And it made me think, like, what is the difference between somebody who quote unquote lands on their feet and somebody who doesn't, who's not in that clear category of victimization. And I think that has been what has motivated me to engage in this critique. That's one thing that's motivated me to make this critique, is that these kinds of subcultures, people like myself, I had a pretty stable family life. I didn't have a ton of generational trauma. I had a fairly strong background to come from, but I think people who are coming from a more vulnerable place, who you could call them weaker. I don't want to disparage people who come from a more vulnerable place, but let's just say that that's how we describe them. I think those are the folks who end up getting hurt more, even if they're not clear victims, by the way these cultures operate. The second reason I was motivated to make this critique is because, as you say, I think there are elements of my upbringing that have served me well. I think those revolve around the category of private character. That is how to be a good person in your relationships, in your family, in your home, in your workplace, in your church, with your friends, etc. And I think evangelicalism writ large has largely failed in training people how to exercise public character. So there's that differentiation between private character and public character. And public character, Reinhold Niebuhr called it civic righteousness. It's how to be a valuable, productive, contributing member of the body politic. And that doesn't mean it's just all about politics. It means being a valuable member of society, your local community, starting there, and then working your way up to whatever degree of, connection or influence or impact you have beyond the community that you walk around in every day. But it really does start, I think, with the local community. And so I think the evangelical community or church has not emphasized this, for a lot of reasons. One of which is, it's individualism. It's focus on an individual faith rather than having a component of community-minded faith. So there are other streams of Christianity that do a good job of emphasizing the impact of collective sin or the impact of sin on the group. That's just not something that evangelicalism really talks about a lot. I also think the isolationism bred that antagonistic stance that I talked about, which also left a lot of evangelicals vulnerable to manipulation, which led to a sense of being combative rather than being a stakeholder, coming to the table, seeking to contribute to the common good and have that conversation with others from different points of view. I think right now there is the ongoing conversation that's always been part of human history, where most of the parts of society are trying, in some respect or another, to talk to one another, to negotiate a way forward. And I think evangelicalism stance towards that conversation for as long as I've been alive, and probably longer than that, has been to be off by itself in the corner, rather than engaging in that larger conversation.
You actually have a great Substack, and one of your Substack articles is titled something like this: "I was taught to be a
Yeah.
good private person and totally neglected on the public side of that." And I think that's super important. That's obviously in our world, like that's right in our heartbeat of what we're trying to think about. And I believe you're right. And I wonder what you think about this. That it seems that there is a lack of thoughtfulness that has gone into really negotiating the role of religion in a person's life in relationship to religion in the public sphere. And it's been a debated question from the beginning days of this nation, when it was when some of the
Yeah.
colonies were designed as religious freedom outposts where religion was the defining narrative, to establishment of a nation that said, we're not going to establish a religious establishment process in this country. And we've declared that to be true, but we really haven't funded it and fueled it in a way that someone can kind of navigate these things, right? And there's a lot of work that goes on in the evangelical world and other church worlds for people who are trying to figure out how to take your personal life and make it more public to share with individuals, or to have it play out in your work environments, right? A lot of that, a lot of, what's your business calling, what's your work calling, how do you work? Very little when it comes to what obligation do we have to the whole. And I sort of get a little dreamy sometimes that maybe we'll find out of this difficult period where our relationship of religion and civic life, religion and government, is at a low ebb right now. It feels to me that maybe part of what will come out of it is some people really taking seriously this call to try to figure out a better way to talk about these things in casual conversations and in more formal conversations with real legitimate thinkers and so on. Do you have any thoughts about that? If that's not your thing, I totally get it. But do you think that's part of it at all?
Well, yeah, I think the term you use, thoughtfulness, is a good one. I think a lot of times, the instinct of religious conservatives or evangelicals towards politics is one of like blunt force trauma. Let me just come in guns a blazing, tell you what I think. If you disagree, too bad for you. Like, this is the way it's got to be. And I do think that there's probably a pretty robust history of a different way of doing things, but that hasn't been applied at scale throughout a lot of evangelicalism. And I would put myself firmly in the category of a student on this. I mentioned, Reinhold Niebuhr. That's somebody who I want to read more of, but I speak as somebody who is aware that there are people from other streams of Christianity who
Mhm.
were probably brought up on Reinhold Niebuhr, or are more familiar with his teachings. He's somebody that I instinctively sense from what I've read so far that he's one of the people who has articulated a different, more thoughtful way of doing this. And I think what my book does more so is try to understand the roots of what created that poverty, more than
Yeah.
being able to really talk about how do we how do we do it differently. I think at the end, I'm really saying, look, I'm grasping
Yeah.
and stumbling
Right.
towards trying to do it better, and that's where I'm at now.
Yeah. And it's part of the human endeavor. It's certainly part of the faith endeavor. Okay, if you have a minute, I want to run one more idea by you. It actually came out of an article in the Washington Post about what's happening in Ottawa County, Michigan. So there's just a lot of things happening in Ottawa County. There's been a takeover of the county commission there by a group of people associated with the same group that has a very Christian religious narrative to what they're up to. So we spend a lot of time there. Washington Post has done a number of exposés on it. And in this article that Greg Jaffe and Patrick Marley write, they use a line that was like one of those light bulb moments for me, where it like illuminated this reality.
Mhm.
And I'm not going to quote it exactly right here, but basically the essence of their almost pass by statement, and like a really good writer can do, right? You make your point in the thing that feels like it was a flyby statement.
Mhm.
And it was that in the trying to the trying to answer the question, why is America successful,
Mhm.
two groups come down on two different sides. The Christians, Christian nationalists in this particular case, want to tell a narrative of God's blessing.
Mhm.
We have been successful because of the blessing of God, not the work of humans.
Right.
People on the political left want to say, we have been successful in this country because of the subjugation of certain people and because of bad practices that have damaged some people to give advantage to others.
Yeah.
And I experience that on a daily basis. The work we do and the people we talk to, there's people that are like, why do you people all want to talk about how bad America was? It's the blessing of God. And if we would do better and live better, the blessings will continue to flow. Right. And then other people are like, we have to tell the truth about how we got here, that
Mhm.
these are stolen lands built, and much of the history of the country was built by stolen peoples, and it's not working for everybody, and we're building on top of the pain of other people. And it feels like those two worlds have become opposite choices, opposite camps.
Mhm.
Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like there was a time when people would say, I don't know, both of those things are true. Like we can talk about both of those realities from a religious perspective.
Mhm.
Do you think about that stuff at all? Does that phrase strike you? Every once in a while I get these things that roll around in my head, and they just I can't seem to, they don't go away. And this feels like one of those, like, oh my gosh, this explains why two groups of people look at each other like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and you are a liar. So do you have thoughts about that?
Sure. I mean, I think the dynamic you're talking about is one of I don't know, like too much of a binary, and you've said it
Hmm.
yourself now. Like when you say both things can be true, I agree with that. If we're talking about, um, we can say that America has both been very good and great, and even historically great in human history, and we can also say that America has committed some grievous sins, some of which were instrumental to its prosperity. When we're talking about what has made America successful, I would probably try to find a middle way through that and just say, whatever your theological beliefs are, we can't, again, this goes in the category of something we can't really prove or even document in any kind of real substantive way. What we can do is look at history and see the ways in which power and sort of the um, luck of history and sort of circumstances has has put America in the perch that it's in. Certainly, the application of power has been for both good and for bad has been a big part of why
Mm-hmm.
America has been successful.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a story of history. That's a story of studying history, knowing and understanding history. Um, and then, the circumstances of history or the circumstances of human development. I mean, the fact that we were separated by an ocean, big factor. The fact that Europe was destroyed after World War II, and we, in part because of that physical separation,
Yeah.
were left intact and then became the reserve currency of the world. Those are significant factors in why we are successful. So all of this is a story that we can know and
Yep.
understand and learn together with good and bad. And it goes again to that category of what can we talk about that we actually know for sure, rather than fighting over things that are really at the end of the day belong in the category of belief. And I'm happy to have people bring those into the public
Yeah.
sphere, but it's a different category of knowledge.
Yeah. No, I hear you. It just seems that like the things that give life flavor and meaning and make art and beauty and music are belief like things, right? Not fact like things. And the motivations for so much of what makes people get up and do what they do is well beyond like articulating the things we can all look at and agree on. Then there's something else just out of our vision, just out of our mind that we're like, there's a world there. I have a friend who uses a phrase, what's the more beautiful world your heart knows is possible, right? Like that's the thing that drives you. And and it feels like when we get, and I'm a very facts sort of person, right? Like that's what, I mean, really motivates me. And I nerd around and spend time on words and conversations, 3, 4 days a week trying to get to some of this stuff. And facts are very unsatisfying. They're the French fries in the Happy Meal. Like as soon as you're done with them, you're like, oh boy, I could take more of those. Like they don't really satisfy, right? People get and then there's something that like, they're like, there's a belief that drives us. And so I guess I'm just rambling on here about the fact that like
No, no,
we
it's good.
struggle because we feel like other people have a different set of beliefs that are going to win over ours, no matter where we are in the facts and the information and the data and the things we can point to. And it feels like there's these two big camps in the war, and one camp is at war with the other and says there can be no goodness of God story, and the other people are like, praise God, it's all about the goodness of God. Don't let your children be told at school that's that these things were bad. And they've become, as you said earlier, like binaries, and they've become dangerous places. And once you spend a little time sort of, I don't know, bringing the peoples together, you start to realize, there's probably even a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh way thing we could describe to this. Because any binary I've ever found myself in is rarely been solved by just going to the other side of the binary. It's usually going somewhere else and then realizing, oh, there were 11 different versions of the thing I thought there were two options for. Oh, it turns out there's 11 or something like that.
I
So
mean,
is that kind of what you're up to in your book too? I mean, it feels like that's what the book is trying to
oh,
get at in some ways.
I think absolutely. I mean, I really appreciate you saying that because it illuminates something for me that is probably something I need to work on. When I talk about the realm of things we can know for sure, to me, that's a realm of adventure
Hmm.
and excitement and um, discovery. It's a world in which that I'm extremely excited about. There's new discoveries, there's new knowledge, there's so much joy in it. Uh, the phrase "truth is stranger than fiction" is absolutely right. Like
Yeah.
if we study history together, we will go on a journey of many surprises and delight. And so I guess I probably need to do a better job of conveying that.
Hmm.
Um, and I appreciate, you kind of bringing that up for me.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great phrase. It's such a pass by phrase too. That just feels like doesn't carry meaning. But when you really think about it, truth is stranger than the fiction you could make up. We say it in other ways a lot. Like, man, you literally couldn't make this up. If a screenwriter pitched this to Hollywood, who would have thought? Yeah, because that's really how it goes. This is something, and truly, our ability to describe something is not the same thing as understanding it. Like there is a temptation to believe that description and precise description is the same as understanding. There's also a
Yeah,
problem we have where truth
yeah,
for a lot of people really means facts, and they're not the same thing.
right.
Information, data, facts uh, may or may not be true. But I don't know. Truth is this elusive little thing, but really
Yeah,
matters. I mean, when you're looking at your child or your partner or a person in a business thing or a person in a I don't know, any interaction, and you're like, you're telling me the truth, right? Like you're not doing some postmodern deconstruction philosophical, well, as Derrida would say, it is truth really. Like you're just like, are we okay? Like, can I trust you on this? Is this gonna like? That's how we live, and truth is super like up in our business. We're all living on these truthy claims sort of all the time. And it's been funny. You kind of write about it, how there was this flip 25 years ago. It was the conservatives who were trying to say, we need to return to truth. And now it's just Freaky Friday. Now it's progressives talking about, whoa, hold on a minute. We need to get to some truth here. We can't, an apple is an apple. You can't be putting up, tell me an apple is a banana. It's kind of thing. I'm like, my gosh, those are the arguments that conservatives used to say to people like me about why my postmodern deconstructionist attitude was somehow a danger. It's really truth is stranger than fiction on this stuff, because we all really do want to live in a world that's trustworthy. And I don't know, John, it feels like people just really don't trust each other at a level now that feels different than in my life. I can't, or my adult life, at least. I can't speak about other times and places. And some of my Black church leader friends will say to me regularly, "Oh, you've just been living in a fiction that there was ever a time where we could trust each other. Like welcome, good morning. I'm glad you woke up to the reality that some of us have been living in the entire time." But it does feel different to me, and I don't know what to exactly do with that. And that's why I appreciate your book so much and your work.
Thank you, Doug. I would just say in closing that I think what I'm ultimately about is finding a way to get closer to the mysteries of the ultimate things in life, of what is ultimately real and true. And we do that by looking at the things closest to us, fumbling and stumbling and inching our way forward. And I think where it brings me is to a place of awe. And I think that is, in a sense, a place of worship. And I would just invite people to come out of their fortresses and to go on that journey with me. That's my invitation to conservative evangelicals, not to think like me, but to see that I've tried to examine my own story, be grateful for it, critique it. And that's something that everybody can do. And I think going forward, if we're going to be inviting people to come out of their fortresses and their castles, we've got to continue to do that ourselves first.
Well, thank you. And thanks for that work. Thanks for being on with us. When people want to find this book, obviously they find it in all the places, called Testimony, Jon Ward, the Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. And they can also find you in other places. I mentioned you have a Substack. I got to that through your website, which I think is jonwardwrites.org. Is that?
You got it. Yep.
Did I remember that right? So they can find and follow all of that there. And I'm guessing you're on all the social media spaces and places. You also run a podcast, don't you?
Yeah, I do a podcast called The Long Game. I try to do it hopefully at least once a month, but sometimes goes a little longer. The last one was actually great. It was David Latt, who wrote very authoritatively and fairly about the free speech flap at Stanford Law School. So lots of different topics on there.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for being with us today. And to all of you, hey, okay, Mike is asking just one very specific question. Have you kept up with Frank Schaeffer on his stuff and what he writes and how he does it? And do you have any thoughts about any of that?
I haven't kept up with Frankie lately over the last several years, but I read a number of his books, over a decade ago, and would correspond with him sometimes, but haven't kept up with the latest.
Yeah. I mean, that's another one of those sort of biographies of an insider of the 70s evangelical movement. And I'll just say to people who aren't familiar with evangelicalism, not only is evangelicalism a wide ecosystem, there's many varieties. It's also really time dependent. All the 18 whatever versions, 1860s, 1880s, 1890s were different. The 1930s version of evangelicals were different than the 1950s version. The 1970s were different than the 1990s. And frankly, the 2016s forward is also a different kind. If you take the metaphor of a virus like the coronavirus, there are different variants of this thing that are contagious in different ways and affect the human body in different ways and affect the body politic in different ways. And like we call it COVID-19 because of what it was discovered, there's an evangelicalism 16 that is still in the body politic system that I think is particularly dangerous and has a whole set of characteristics that look very little like the 1970s version. And I know it's easy to just assume that evangelicals have been a thing, are still that thing, and will remain that thing. It's just a lot more complicated than that. So it's my take. And if you want to add any correction to that, since you're the guest here on the podcast, you're welcome to.
No, I just think there's always been a lot of change because it hasn't been an institutionally driven movement. It's been fairly anti-institutional and largely built around growth. And so those are two incentives that drives it to be constantly shifting, I think. Yeah.
And it's built around people as much as it's built around any ideas or values. I mean, it's really a people-centric movement, and changes as people change. It can be its upside. It should be its upside. It's one thing I always liked about it as an adherent in it. I'm like, people matter in this world. You can actually influence this world a lot.
Right.
And people really matter, and they influence this world an awful lot. And that's not always great. And sometimes it's quite wonderful, but it just is. That's the way that it is. All right. Well, we better stop now, or Dan's like, good grief, Doug's going to start up again. We were just landing this plane, like the wheels were down and we were coming in, and here we go. All right. So Jon, thank you. Appreciate it. And we'll stay in touch.
Doug, thank you for having me on. Really enjoyed the conversation.
You bet. Okay. Yeah. Hey y'all. We'll see.